Were there individuals that surprised you? Were there people in your squad that you thought were going to do well who didn't? Or ones that you were doubtful about that turned out to be very reliable? Did any of that happen?
Well, I guess it kind of did. I do know what you're saying there, and it kind of sifts the men and the boys out a little bit. And, you know, you can be real gung-ho and all that stuff and competing to get more stripes or get officers' bars and all that. But the guys that would really outgrow the war are guys who were out of the hills and that stuff. They were there because, hell, I'm not here to see how competitive or how high I can reach in the military status. I just want to get this damn war over. And those were the kind of guys that, in my mind, really got the job done when you come right down to it. Who's going to stay here in combat and who's not going to stay? Because, you know, and I guess you'd call it fairly intelligent, competitive people can get sick awful quick, you know, sometimes, and it usually happens about the time there was some combat coming off. And these kind of things, I guess you kind of separate the men from the boys, I think. And, of course, when you go back to peacetime, then everybody looks for somebody to walk down the street with a flag, you know, and make it look like a real outfit. That isn't combat. That's peacetime stuff. I don't know whether I answered your question there or not.
Well, I hear a lot of guys talk about, damn, Maxwell Taylor told us, all I want out of you boys is 2 days and 2 nights in combat. Then you can go back to England when that's over. There's a lot of resentment about that. You were how many days in Normandy?
I think we were there pretty near 30 days, as I recall.
And you never got wounded?
No, never did.
You're one of the very few original E Company people who didn't. So now you're back in England, and you have all these false alerts. Well, not false alerts, but alerts, and then the mission doesn't come off. And you stand on again, and then finally it's September, and you're off on a beautiful blue day for Holland. And this was going to be different. Of course you knew it was going to be different because you've got some sense of what combat is and that they really are shooting real bullets at you and you really are going to be losing some friends, if not your own life. Or was there a sense of confidence of, well, I've been through this once and we handled Normandy, or what? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, let me back up. You just kind of brought back a memory. After we came back from Normandy to England, of course, the sergeants all stayed in one hut. But the first platoon was there in pretty good-sized barracks, around 30 guys, you know, in there. When we came back, about half of those fellows didn't come back. And I know Bill Garnier and I used to spend a lot of time thinking about Jesus. Here we've got half a hut full of guys here, and we aren't even started in the war yet. And we don't have a Chinaman's chance of ever getting out of this thing. Hell, we're just getting ready to get into it. And I said, if we lose half the barracks there in one little maneuver in France, I said, forget it. We'll never get home. And he kind of felt the same way I did. And he and I went to Scotland, and that's when we got the tattoos and all that kind of stuff. And he said, oh, hell, let's forget it. We're not going to make it home. I really didn't think that losing that many men in one little deal like that, and then all the whole war ahead of us, I didn't think we'd ever make it home. Then you go in up there in Holland, and I'll have to say that was a better organized deal from our standpoint. It was pretty badly screwed up there in the Polish and the British part of it. That was just a slaughter across the river there. But I can remember some things that happened in Holland, but I actually didn't think that I'd ever get back home. And then, of course, as you get along, and the more it goes along further, you think, well, gee, I might make it after all. These are the kind of things that pass through your mind, so you kind of get a little more cautious. Holland's a lot more action up there, and we had one little deal down on the dike here. The platoon was down. We probably had 15 or 18 men, and we had outposts right along the Rhine, kind of down on the flats. And we put 2 men down on each one, and then at night I would go out and sit on one of the outposts with another man, and I always picked kind of a guy that I would consider less dependable. You might say the kind who would go to sleep on you, and I would spend my time with him out there. It would be me in one of those outposts. So we went down there, and it was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. That same night, earlier in the night, we rolled a bunch of loudspeakers down there. This was arranged by the regiment, and they broadcast in German to the Germans across the river, and they said, I think it was about 12 o'clock midnight, we're going to lay down a barrage of smoke, and then all of our soldiers are instructed not to fire, and you are welcome to come over and surrender. And that will be good until something like 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and some of them did come across. They came through where our platoon was at that time, and then after that, the smoke cleared up, and we went back to combat just like before. So then later that night, I'm talking about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I was down on this outpost with this other fellow, and I said, all right, are you awake? I'd been there, and he'd been sleeping down in the hole, and I said, are you awake? And he said, oh, yeah, I'm fine. I said, all right, you stand up now. By God, I don't want you going to sleep, because he had done that before. I'm not going to go to sleep, Sergeant. Don't worry about me. So I get down in the hole and cover up with a shelter. I was sleeping, and the next thing I noticed, somebody's walking on my face down in there, stepping down in the hole, and I started scrambling around. It wasn't that big a hole, and hell, there's 3 guys in this hole instead of 2. So I come up out of there in the shelter half and all of this, and here's a German moving around. Webb was asleep, and here's another German who had come over to surrender and fell in the hole. When we finally got all straightened up, he said, comrade, hell, all he wanted to do was surrender, and he fell in the hole. Man, I chewed that Webb something fierce, and I got up and searched the hole first. Then I searched him, and there was some metal. I looked at him. I couldn't talk German, but I looked at him, and he'd brought his razor. But the story we found out, I guess he knew it. That night, when we had the speakers out there, you could hear the Schmeisser machine pistols going off over there, and hell, they weren't shooting at us. It was the SS non-coms over there keeping these people, these Army guys, from surrendering. They had to shoot them to keep them in their place, and of course, that's why this guy that came over, he was just some guy that they had drafted in there out of the People's Army, and he didn't want any part of it. That was an interesting little thing.
Did you see much shooting with the POWs?
I didn't do any of that. I never killed a POW. I know that a lot of it was done in our company.
I'm not making an accusation. A lot of it was done not just by your company.
Yes, it was. We had one fellow there who was Jewish. You didn't dare trust him with a POW out of sight. That's just the way it was.
Have you heard the story of Spears just before he joined E Company back in Normandy? You laughed. You know the story? I've heard so many stories about Spears.
I have to say, if I sat here and told you a bunch of stuff about what I heard about Spears, it'd be nothing but gossip. You got to remember, a non-com and an officer are just like pretty near 2 different units. That's the way it was when I was there. The night of D-Day, I just don't know. That Spears was kind of wild.
Well, some of the stories are just blood-curdling, so I don't doubt it. I'm hoping to get to see him. He's living out in California. At least he's on the roster there.
I understand you got to talk to Jack Foley.
I got a letter from him just the other day. Were you in on the 1,000-yard charge, as some of them call it in Holland?
Well, yes, I think that was a little bit over-exaggerated. We were in Holland and there was a dike, and then you had these long leveled flats and hedgerows down in there, and just ditches. So the water floated up and back down in there, and that night the Germans had a bunch of rubber boats, and they got a bunch of their people across the river that night, and they were all down in those flats. And we got up in the morning and found out they had a pretty good chunk of men across the river. The Rhine was aligned then. Hell, we just had to get down in there and run them back out. Now, I think that's the charge you're probably talking about, but yes, I was in on that, and I'll never forget, I had a guy named Cobb with me. He was a machine gunner in that outfit. I think he's the one that you mentioned earlier there, though you didn't name him. We were down there, and we stuck our heads down a hedgerow, and there was just, I'd say, about 60 or 70 Germans laying there with their head up against the hedgerow. They were looking towards us, and we looked down at them, and I got Cobb up there and set the machine gun up and shot right down through them. But that's part of the attack I think you're talking about. They had to fix bayonets, and I have to say they're stretching things a little bit there on that bayonet attack. So it was just another combat maneuver, getting them out of there, running them out.
Anything else about Holland before we go to Bastogne?
Let me think here a minute. I think since you're talking about E Company, there's a fellow, and I don't know whether anybody else has mentioned this to you or not, but he was a sergeant from Toccoa. In fact, I think he was in the group that when my wife and I got married, his name was Punchy Deal. When I was telling you about, we're kind of backing up here, Sergeant Deal, we called him Punchy. I forget his first name, but he was a sergeant there right from the start with the rest of us, and he went through and he got a battlefield commission. Now I'm talking about before Holland, after Normandy, and he was assigned to another battalion, And he was leading a group over there. I think they were going in there at Zahn, where the bridge is, and he got a direct hit with an 88. But he was a real nice sort of fellow, and of course he was well liked. He got a battlefield commission, but that's the name that should be brought out. Deal, Punchy Deal. He was from Indiana. Okay, we're back up in Holland. I'm trying to think of, as you know, our mission was not only to try and save that bridge at Zahn, which we didn't get done, but then as Dempsey's Second Army, which was lined up at the Belgian border, was supposed to go 2 or 4 abreast of tanks right up the highway, and we had to go out and secure the flanks with the thoughts that they would get across that bridge and get on up there before the Germans could blow it up. And of course, we were over here protecting the flanks at a place called Noonan, and Bob Rader and I were on one tank riding in there, and we stopped at a woods before we got into town, and we were in ditches longer in town, and I'm talking about a quarter of a mile away. There was a Panzer tank that stuck its nose around the end of a building, and we saw him and told the tank commander, "Don't go out there now. There's a tank down there. You get ready and blast him the next time he sticks his nose down there." Well, this British told me, he said, "Well, son, I can't shoot at him if I can't see him." And I said, "Well, look, if you pull out there, you're going to be in trouble," because that's what they were trying to do, to suck him out. But anyway, they said, "I know." So they moved on out. 1, 2, 3 tanks moved out of this woods and down the road, and all at once, over here in the side field, there was a haystack. That haystack opened up, and they rolled an 88 out, and they shot the tank next to the woods and blew it out, and the other tanks couldn't get back, and they went right down the line, and we laid there in the ditch that night, burning. We couldn't get anywhere, but that was a real bad deal up there. They knocked out 3 tanks there so quick, and the tank down in town, they were just using him as bait to suck him out. This is funny. It's about this guy named Cobb. He's from Harlan County, Kentucky. He's the guy that you mentioned there, but you didn't name him, and you can use it if you want. I don't care. He was in my platoon. He used to cause me a lot of trouble, but he was our head scrounger. He'd always go out and steal the food and that stuff and bring it back, so we had something to eat. But anyway, we went up to relieve the British on the Rhine after the front line became established, and they had a command post in the house, a farmhouse there, and that farmhouse was just shelled and just practically blown down. And in the middle of the house, they had one room, and they had hung blankets up so that they could have a light in there, and that's where we went in, and I think it was the Canadians or British, I don't know which it was, and they said, okay, here we were, a whole platoon standing in this room, and hell, you couldn't even sit down hardly. So I said, well, work some of these up so we can spread some of these guys out a little bit, so we can read these maps and find out where your command posts are, your route posts. He said, all these rooms are all right in here. We'd been walking through all night long, so Cobb says, where do you want this goddamn gun and all that? He was a real complainer, and I said, just go ahead in there, Cobb, under the blanket and throw your bedroll down, and I'll be back with you in a little bit. Okay, he says. He goes in there, and pretty soon, out comes Cobb through that blanket, and we were all sitting there looking at these maps, and he's wiping crap out of his eyes, and I said, what the hell happened? He said, there's a goddamn shell-shocked calf in that room, and I threw my bedroll down, and he's crapped on my face, and I'm telling you, I never laughed so hard in my life, and he was wiping it out of his eyes. That was one of the funniest things I ever saw. Anyway, I can't think of anything else in Holland. We got a lot of guys hurt up there.
Thanks for watching. Just to add a couple of things, the man John Martin was talking about was James Punchy Deal. He was also likely referring to Joe Liebgott as the Jewish soldier who couldn't be trusted with POWs. As we know now, Joe Liebgott was not Jewish but Catholic. With the name, many of the men always assumed he was Jewish. If you have a thought on anything John Martin has discussed in this interview, drop a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, please help the channel out by giving it a like.